Hey, Jamie McKeever here from the Wessex League committee. We recently updated some of our sword rules, and I wanted to do a quick video to explain it to people because there's been some comments about why have we done these and some other equipment rules as well. So if you're not aware, the changes which I'll go through, we have set a minimum tip size, expectation, and preferred size. We have set formal definitions for flexibility of the blade, which are reducing next year. We have mandated breaches, and we have allowed Siggy Kings as a specific instance of what we would class as a blunt sword that will be allowed in the longsword tournaments. We've also made some minor adjustments to the permitted length ranges and permitted weight ranges for various different swords. I will explain each of these and why in turn. The short version of the why for all of these is based off several pieces of research. One, last year we measured all of the swords and recorded the measurements of the swords in use. That's about 750 measurements. We linked them to every injury that happened across the league, and we tried to understand what patterns of sword relate to injuries that we see. The second two sources of data that were used for this are from my company, Historical Fencing Research. We ran a project called Safety Tips that published earlier this year that looked into the safety of swords with tips and different tipping methods when considering pushing on a mask and when considering the risk of puncturing a target. And I ran a second piece of work as part of that case study, and I ran a second piece of work to support the safety tips called 10 case studies in puncture risk that looked at when do puncture injuries occur in HEMA, what kind of conditions happen, and give some examples for situations where punctures have happened. If you want to read those studies, they are on my website, historicalfencingresearch.com. The Wessex League data is not yet published, but will be published through that same website when I'm able to. But the need to get the rules out early for the league this year had meant that we've had to go ahead of publishing some of the information. All of these sources of safety data basically agree that narrower tips are more likely to lead to puncture injury, stiffer swords are more likely to lead to concussive injuries. In particular, I'll start with blade flex. Right? Why have we set our blade flex where we have, and why are we reducing it in future years? Well, first of all, the main piece of evidence we have for this is from our own data, from the injury data from last year. We analysed every property we could think of. We looked at all of them. We tried to see what trends there were. For the most part, there's no relationship that we can find between things like cutting injuries and weight of the sword or anything like that. Right? Heavier swords inherently lead to this, so there needs to be something more interesting to come up with those. The only thing we could link directly to injuries was thrusting injuries, linking to stiffness of blades. So of the thrusting injuries we had last year, which made up about 20% of the injuries that we can attribute to a sword, all but one of them were caused by a sword over 16 kilograms of flex. The one exception was a sword that to the throat, missed the gorget, hit the throat, and was a relatively minor. Very minor injuries are excluded from this analysis, I should say. When you're looking across the swords in use, that number is significant, and it's statistically significant because most of the swords are below that flex, and most of the injuries are above that flex. That's why we've set 16 as the maximum for future years. This year is 20, right? And all the other things are going down slightly, to 12 and to 14. We've set the thresholds where we have this year to not exclude anything that was passed last year. Last year we measured things, but we didn't have an official figure where we said 20 kilograms is too high. We are now de facto what we settled on was 20 kilograms was the threshold that we were passing after a visual inspection of the stiffer swords. So if your sword passed last year at 20 kilograms, it should pass again this year. 16, particularly for longsword, excludes, unfortunately, quite a lot of swords. The stiffer end of Againiers, a lot of Cvetans, although a lot of Cvetans were also failing on the 20 kilograms. Having said that, there are also plenty of Againiers that come well under that. All Siggies come under that. Many Cvetan brands, so the Cvetan FFGs come up stiffer, but the Lichtenauer, the 1595, come up below that. And then there's a bunch of other sort of less used common longswords that may or may not fall on either side. right? So we didn't want to do it in 1 year because we didn't think that the UK could physically buy that many swords ahead of this. And it's 20% of injuries. You know, we want to reduce that. We want to get rid of those injuries as far as we can, but it's not like 100% of injuries came from thrusting injuries. Cuts seem to still be the biggest source of injury. So yeah, that's why we've allowed a grace period of a year. Most of those injuries were percussive. Bruises, bruised ribs, bruised heads on the mask, that kind of stuff. So the tip standard we've set was, again, from the data we collected, we realized that actually we said things like, if it's rolled, it's fine, right? And we were, in fact, sometimes saying with rolled tips that this needs to be tipped or this needs not to be tipped. What we wanted to do was give a figure for actually what is too small. Particularly some tips that we saw, particularly the smaller plastic tips, were actually smaller than many rolled tips, and probably were too small. In fact, I think the smallest tip that passed was indeed a plastic tip. So we have set the minimum requirement for this as 75 millimeters squared, which doesn't make a lot of sense to most people. To put that into context, it's about the size of a typical Siggy longsword, or a 9mm bullet case. Our preferred is 120. 120 is, this is a .303, yeah, .303 bullet case. This is about 120. The standard Regenier blade tip is about 120, give or take. I will say as well, if your tip is smaller than that, you always have the option of tipping it, right? Smaller tips are not banned, they just require a tip. So if your sword is under that tip area, put a tip on it. There will be plastic, thermoplastic available on the day. We would prefer you did it ahead of time because it needs half an hour to set before you can use it. We have a video linked on the same YouTube channel, which I'll link in the comments, on how to do it. And if you are doing it yourself, I recommend buying the brand ThermoWorks. That was one that we know to be sufficiently strong. Some other brands are less hard. So why have we set that threshold? Well, this is driven from the safety tips research. Both the experimental research of where we stabbed a target from different energies, and the case studies research show that narrower tips are far more likely to cause puncture injuries. The difference is pretty staggering if you go and look at some of that research. As well as that, material doesn't seem to matter too much in terms of puncture risk, although shape probably does to some extent, but we can't really put that in the rules just yet because we don't know all those factors. But in the case studies, narrower tip swords still punctured people. So we wanted to say that kind of regardless of what material it is, there is a minimum tip size that applies to every single material. The specific threshold we chose is a bit arbitrary, admittedly. We don't yet have enough data to say definitively this point is safe, this point is unsafe. What we did was we looked at what are the common swords out there, what do they typically have, and swords that are typically safe that we would normally pass without blinking. We have said, okay, we'll do that. That might change in future as more evidence emerges, but for now we've set it at that threshold where it looks like most swords that are considered to be safe tips and you do not routinely see issues with have these thresholds. But despite that, we've put a puncture resistance minimum for breaches for good reason. Well, if you go to both the historical forensic research pieces of work that I mentioned, while we didn't have any puncture injuries, thank God, at Wessex and never have, going through particularly those case studies showed me that absolutely injuries, puncture injuries, quite nasty ones, can occur with this kind of tip striking non-Newton-rated cloth. If you don't want to read it, the worst one is with a tip exactly like this, going 40 centimeters through somebody's hand. There are plenty of other instances with pretty large tips striking to lightly protected locations, puncturing the person shallowly or quite deeply. We want to avoid that. We set the expectation that we were probably going to put breaches in 2 years ago. So if you've been attending Wessex, you probably have heard that we were planning on doing this for a while. We decided, looking at this evidence, that absolutely, we should be mandating breaches. There are just too many exchanges where thrusts, particularly hard thrusts, can come in, be driven down into the leg, especially the upper leg, for us to be willing to take that risk in the context of events like Wessex that have over 100 attendees and over 5,000 exchanges in any given event. So breaches are required for puncture resistance. As I say, the exception, we recognize that not everybody can find breaches that fit them. What we want is something that we can prove to be sufficiently puncture resistant. So if you really cannot use breeches, you can contact us. Please contact us before the event to discuss it rather than at the event. We will not be having this conversation on the day. You have to have been kind of cleared by the organisers beforehand as an option to it. Those are the main safety considerations for reasons why we've changed our rules. That's why we've set a flex this year to formalise what we did before, and we're reducing it next year. That's why we set both the minimum tip size, a recommended tip size, and a requirement to wear breeches, because we know even with our recommended tip size that punctures are possible. The other changes we've made have been to reflect what's available on the market, which is different to when we first set the rules, to try and be more permissive about what is allowed in the tournament. So all of those are increasing the towards allowed, not decreasing them. And we have reduced the weight allowance to 750 grams for saber. We have increased the allowed size for side sword up to 95 centimeters in the blade. And we have allowed Siggy Kings as one example of a blunt longsword to allow. Essentially what we've done with both those first two changes is to reflect actually that the market has changed. We used to have 780, I think, grams. Most sabers come just under that. Most Siggy sabers, unless you get a very specific hilt, would be considered to be too heavy, but I would consider them to be perfectly normal military sabers. And brands have kind of gradually shifted downwards since we set those rules. So we don't want to provide rules that no one can comply with, and we've adjusted that to accommodate it. Same is true of side sword blades. So if most manufacturers are producing blades at either 90 centimeters or 95 centimeters. Our previous 92 centimeter pretty much doesn't exist on the market. You can't buy it, or if you can, you have to custom it, and So we looked at what people were actually offering, and we decided, okay, well, do we want to include that type of sword in our tournament? And decided yes. The side sword range of 80 to 95 centimeters is about the same as most of the other weapons that range. Either the lowest, I think, is saber at a 10 centimeter gap between shortest and largest, long swords at 15 centimeters, rapiers at 20 centimeters. As it also corresponds with the shortness of blade, percentage-wise, it's pretty similar in terms of the percentage range allowed for all the weapons at this point. Lastly, the Siggy King. We were asked about this question a lot. I did have the opportunity to measure some last year, compare them. And we have a long-standing rule to not allow blunt longswords. The reason for that is we used to allow exceptions if they were safe enough. And everybody came with a bunch of different swords and they said, mine's definitely safe enough. And then when we told them, no, it's not, or when we allowed them and realized later on that we were wrong, it caused issues. So we decided, screw this, we're having a blanket rule. We've now looked at and assessed Siggy Kings pretty thoroughly, and we're all happy that they are sufficiently safe to use in a longsword tournament, and no less safe than many other feathers that are out there that would handle similarly. So Siggy Kings are allowed. I am aware that a lot of other manufacturers have started producing sword-shaped swords, training swords, that may be safer than their other offerings. Regenia's produced one recently, Veteran's produced one recently. I have not had the opportunity to assess or know those, and maybe there's something else. So my advice to you would be, if you have a sword that you think is definitely safe, you can bring it along. Bring along a feather as well, because you will probably not be allowed to use it. But what you should do is show it to a committee member so that we can measure it and assess whether in future years that might be something that we also provide as an exception. But don't bring a sword along and expect to be using it that day. My default will be no, and you'll need to have a separate feather, a separate appropriate sword to use if that's the path that you're going down. So hopefully that explains why we have made the changes that we have and why we are further changing things in the future. As I say, 2 of those studies I referenced are already published. The data that we've got on injuries and sword data should be published soon, but we needed to make the rules changes before doing that. It's a lot of work to get the data published in a state that can be shared and the analysis that underpins it, but time marches on and Wessex League is fast approaching, so we couldn't delay on publishing our sword changes. Thanks for watching. If you have questions or concerns, feel free to post in the comments or message the Wessex League directly.